Hi, Philip and I are here and welcome you, listeners. And Philip, I welcome you too.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for having me.
It's good to see you on screen again and hear your voice, which I know we talk often. And I have the privilege of spending time with you and have for many years. And so I look forward to our discussion today, having followed the two previous discussions and the two before that with Pedro, and see if we can develop any of the ideas we had or any of the knowledge that we gained in the midst of the conversations we've had. And I appreciate the opportunity greatly. So
Yeah, definitely.
welcome.
Likewise.
Yeah, thank you. So some of the last items that we came up with, I'll start at the bottom of the list on the outline, just as a reminder, which I know I just emailed to you so that you've got them in front of you also, but for anyone listening, some of the issues were that we are always present, topics, I would say. Fear of not getting what we want or losing what we have is natural when we don't think where we are. We think we should be somewhere else. If where we are is where everything is, and we think we should be somewhere else, the fear of losing what we have would be natural, because the impression of thinking we should only be where we're not would mean that where we are with all there is and all we have is no longer where we are with all we have. So that sort of dichotomy feeds on itself. And you can see, if you unravel that a little bit, that it makes sense to constantly have that feeling of not getting what we want or losing what we have when we're imagining we shouldn't be where we are. And I think that's a good basis. You were also talking earlier about this idea that you hear in movies and conversation about having no other choice.
Mm-hmm.
And if choice always allows the choice not to be chosen, then the idea of having no other choice would suggest that that choice isn't available, and what we're thinking of as a choice wouldn't be a choice at all. If we have no other choice, it would be an instinct, or it would be something that would happen like a knee-jerk reflexive action when the doctor pings your knee with that rubber mallet and the reflex happens.
Yeah.
And my experience is, in reactive thinking, our reactions, unless they're to an immediate threat, are reacting against a threat perceived to be something other than what we're thinking, because the defensive nature of a thought, if it's a lie, is automatically defensive, because the only way it survives or appears to survive is by defending it and denying it and being delusional in your idea about it and thinking of it as reality or truth, rather than seeing that it's simply a supposition and a conclusion of self-centered thinking, imagining that it's conclusive enough to become real and true, when in fact reality doesn't need anything in thought for it to be exactly what it is. Reality was here well before we started thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting talking about the defensiveness. It just makes me think of, like, let's say you go up to, I don't know, up to Northern California, past Marin County, and you go to like the Redwood Forest, and you know, it's pretty evident that those trees there by Muir Beach and the Muir Woods, that those are redwood trees, and no one has to really defend that they're anything different than that. But when it comes to thoughts, if we try to convince other people that that's not a redwood tree, it's actually this type of tree. It's a palm tree, and you're willing to go to whatever lengths to prove that that redwood tree is a palm tree. If you fit that to how we are with certain thoughts in our lives, you'd see that that example fits perfectly. And also, um, it fits perfectly with kind of stuff that's going on in the world. Like, I don't want to take in like the Ukraine Russian thing, but war that's going on. But at the same time, Putin has a certain idea in his head of getting back the glory of what Russia was before 1989, 1990. And, land that he thinks is still his, he's going after. And, for that one idea and one thought, it's causing a lot of carnage because that person has a particular, you know, military power. So it's interesting. I just think that, human beings will go to a certain nth degree, including death, to prove something right that may actually be, it's very clearly wrong.
Well, in that example is exactly what happens when we make believe that a limited idea, meaning limited information, is true and real, when anything I make believe is true or real is immediately challenged by new experience that tells me very quickly it's not actually true or real. It's just simply a conclusion I've made or a decision I've made that is subject to evidence that it isn't true or real. That if it's being challenged or if it needs to be defended, it's evidence that something about it isn't complete and whole, because truth and reality isn't a part-time here and there, not there sort of thing. It's or there and not here, or then and not here. It's always here and now. It's always available. It's always complete and whole. So if the basis of my thinking is on simply thinking my thinking is correct, I'm going to feel desperate. And my experience is, and proposal is, that ego is, in fact, simply the desperation caused in those thoughts about who we think we are is at risk. And for me to put my whole stake and effort into managing an image of who I am as though I need to manage it correctly to prove it's who I am is to mean that I have to demand of others to think the way I do, or else see them as threats to my existence.
Yeah.
And this disease has been a human problem since, as far as I can tell, modern history has been written, including the Bible. So it's what you're saying is really seeing the disease at the macro level of what we do as individuals on the micro level, and actually feed the system of thought that accommodates or enables those sorts of activities to go on without just simply being dismissed out of hand by people and disempowering the groups of people that make believe that their idea must be good for everyone. And as a result, they feel justified in force and violence and death to support it. It's no different than addiction when the person tries to kill themselves, or an addiction is, in fact, a slow form of suicide. And it's really trying to kill a self that doesn't even exist, except to the internal struggle of the person who makes believe it's who they are.
Which shows that like everything is a reflection of itself. I mean,
Of the thought.
Of the thought, but even the universe in general. I mean, if you look at who we are on the individual level, or even our body is a universe within a universe.
Yeah.
Our not having the right term, but our blood system, you could take any system within us and cells. There's so many different individual actors that run without us consciously thinking about that. Really, we're just a reflection out to exactly how the universe is. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So, I think it's also interesting if
we're made up. We're literally made up of the same components and live on the basis of life. Well, these are life forms that we have. We're not living life. We're expressing life through a form that are projections, because the substance of who we are is the same with everybody. It's the same elements. It's the same molecule. It's all the same. It's very, 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 very different, even when it comes to the genetic differences between us in terms of humans. There's almost no difference at all on the platform. But in an absolute basis, there can't be any difference, or it wouldn't be absolute.
Yeah, yeah. And I think another point I wanted to bring up about about Russia and Ukraine was, if you look about, you'll hear these headlines like Russia blocked Facebook, blocked Instagram, blocked, all these different type of other social medias. And then you hear about people in that country using VPNs to bypass those blocks. Because it goes against the state media and that agenda that they want to justify the war and the thoughts that they're having to go to that war. I think what's important about that is we can reflect back and look at our own lives and see how are we doing similar things to ourselves to be in denial of what is and try to defend certain thoughts that are wrong,
Well, I would say the only thoughts that are ever defended are wrong, because right speaks for itself and doesn't need to fight. There is no contrast between reality and expressing reality or truth. There is no division because it's what everyone already knows. It isn't what everybody necessarily already thinks. But what's interesting to your point, Philip, is that we are now living in an era where people can openly communicate on levels that have never been available to humans. Though I suspect we have a telepathic interactive capacity that we haven't realized and developed, that we have been aware of. But in the same way, we can deny the present state of our knowing awareness right now through a preoccupation of thinking about thinking and make believe that that present state isn't there simply because we're consumed with the intoxication of thoughts that we're having, is the same element that just simply hasn't been developed. And the things that make cell phones and cell connections and internet that make that availability available is really a metaphor, as you said, a reflection of who we are in essence. It's just the beginning of humans being able to communicate on levels so that they can see that what they're being told isn't always true. And when governments attempt to control their people, the government itself is admitting that it's weak in its supposition that it's actually serving the people that it is responsible for, claims to be responsible for, while it's in fact serving a very narrow group, just like self-centeredness does. My experience when I used drugs is I hung out with people who did drugs like I did. And in being there, that seemed normal. So I created this collection of people that we all kind of conspired to make sure that we didn't really mention to each other that what we were doing probably wasn't the best we could be doing. So it made it seem easier, but it was really just a cunning development of scheme that was imposed. So most governments support, I mean, I don't know about most governments, but I would say governments often support a very narrow collection of interest and claim to be representing the people, which is why they're constantly threatening their own people to stay in line, because the people know better than to think what they're hearing is actually what's happening, because they know by their own experience that if there's plenty of people living well within the government and the rest of the people aren't living that well, there's some breach between the obligation of the government to serve the people it's actually authorized or has been charged with serving. So, but that is absolutely, as you said, no different than it's a reflection on a grander scale of the internal dialogue of a self with a self, thinking about thinking that somehow or another I have a self to talk to when I talk to myself, and think that that self is real enough to negotiate a truce with or a settlement with when I'm constantly in conflict over the whole fact that I'm talking to something that's imagined effectively.
Yeah.
And use it to excuse what I'm thinking so I can blame it on my ego and my thinking and my mind, my thoughts, my brain, society, whatever the blame is that I'm sending out there has nothing to do. I know the blame and fault rests in the ideas I have that aren't true. And so I turn in every other direction to the degree that I want to be intoxicated with those thoughts and addicted to those thoughts. I immediately make believe it can't be me. It's got to be everything else. And that's a pretty big leap to avoid simply saying, oh, I'm at the center of this. I'm the one causing this. Those reactions are telling me that I'm doing things wrong, and I'm thinking of them as things to blame on others rather than take advantage of the information they're giving me and saying, thank you. I'm really being angry with others to basically condemn them, hold them in contempt for what I'm actually contemptful for doing.
Yeah, and I think, I think it's important, and this might have been my going to the beginning of our first conversation with Pedro. One of my things was always how the macro influences the micro, or you could say, and the micro influences the macro. And, yeah, there's 5,000 people who are being arrested for protesting in Moscow. you know that's important, because it's not everybody is believing whatever that macro message is. And I think at the same point, both of it influences the individual and the societal at large. And for me, when I can look at it as, I have my mind, and then there's the societal mind and the cultural mind, you start to see that sometimes the thoughts you take on as your own were kind of culturalized or habitualized over time, or your parents habitualized those thoughts. And it reminds me of, I don't want to bring my ex into it, but, she lived in this thing that she always wanted to talk about the future and current events. And that was basically it, and that is, in a certain way, a certain type of culturalized idea of how reality is. And even when you go into towns like Los Angeles or New York, there's a certain game that's played in all those towns, of how to operate and how to get ahead and how to all these other things. And the whole reason I'm saying this is because in the end of the day, it's like, I think the thing that we landed on at the end of the last conversation was choice. Like, I have the choice to believe those thoughts, or I have the choice not to believe those thoughts. And within that choice, it's an action. It's an action, just like choosing to go to the restroom when you have to go, or choosing to, drive your car and go to the farmer's market. That's a choice that you're making. So the thoughts and images that I cultivate in my mind are a choice, an action that I can take. And I think that's really where personal freedom and responsibility is kind of, I know with what I've talked about, I've gone through lately in the last 2 months, it's helped me to, what, if anything, these 2 months have taught me is how important it is to choose, to know that I have the action to choose the thoughts and the visions and images that I want in my life. And that when I'm just letting it be at the whim of society and the whim of whatever is around me to influence my thoughts and my ideas in my head, I I am more likely to be susceptible to things that I will feel a victim about.
Yes. What you're acknowledging, though, that the idea, and we talked about this during the week, the real sticking point is making believe that our thoughts can ever be true and real if they're expressing anything less than an absolute knowing awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is that any limited thought can't be real or true. It's simply a consideration. And if it's limited, it is within the context of an absolute. It's a possibility of what's absolute, just like it's a possibility that we can lie within an absolute state of being. We have that same freedom to choose those things, and we have the same freedom to suffer the consequences of those things. And as you were talking about the macro and the micro, they're basically the same coin. The heads is never without the tails, even when it lands on the tails and only reveals the head. Few of us would think because the tail wasn't there, that it wasn't, because it wasn't seen, it wasn't there. And yet when thinking thinks that way and thinks that what we're thinking isn't what we're thinking, we think we're really not thinking it, because it seems to be hidden in this way that doesn't give our senses the perceptive ability. And yet we have this awareness that something is clearly gnawing at us and eating at us and irritable within us and discontent within us and dissatisfied and depressed and numb and feeling alienated. And all of those experiences are witnesses, their body language. They're literally, our ability to be functionally literate is to begin to read that body language for what it's saying rather than think of it as something to get away from. which is natural in an addictive thought pattern. When I think I'm a victim, I think I'm a victim to the feelings I'm having. If the feelings are as a result of the thoughts I'm having, which are an action, as you're pointing out, they're the primary action. There is no choice in an absolute nature. I don't choose to have an absolute nature. None of us do. If anything, we were chosen by it or simply a product of it. Whether it's a choice or not at that point, I don't know. But I would suggest that if there is anything absolute, it isn't a choice. It's a state of being that allows us the potential to make choices. It allows us the potential to recognize what is possible and express what's possible. And part of what's possible is to think that what's impossible is possible by making believe that a lie can become true. If I nurse it long enough and maintain it long enough and beat other people with it long enough to think that somehow, like you hear the comment that if you repeat it long enough, it becomes truth. That's insane for society to make that claim on a broad public basis and think that because people agree with lies, that they become contaminated, just like with a virus or any disease, that all of a sudden it makes the thing completely independent enough to basically force humanity to succumb to that reality, which it doesn't. It's never been true. Truth is never in question. It's never in doubt. So because it doesn't think of itself, it simply knows what it knows as it knows what it knows. It's just a present state of being that's very different than what we conclude as knowledge within thinking.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you just
Please.
For regular drama's sake, to add some drama in the conversation. What I do think what it comes down, let me make sure this thought doesn't leave me, but that saying that, if you say it long enough, if it becomes true, is, in my opinion, an illogical use of a universal principle, which for me, I believe it's the universal principle of, I forget the name of it, but whatever the secret is of manifesting. It's like if we cultivate certain thoughts, certain images, visions, and we choose to believe it, we can start having that in our own reality manifest itself. I've experienced that to be true. I mean, multiple times. So I think in a way it's that thought of like, if you say something long enough, it becomes true, is kind of a perversion of a universal principle that we have been given as human beings to have the choice to use or not use.
Yes. But again, as a perversion, it's perverted. And as a result, it simply shows that we're capable of manifesting that the messes we experience in humanity are manifestations of the perversion of thinking that we've been doing so long as to make believe it's true and real. And collectively, we've witnessed this for thousands of years and never talked about it as something being done by us individually, not because we have to, not because we're faulty by nature, simply because we haven't looked at it accurately and simply recognized that if we're making believe we are the creators of truth and reality, we are at the same time denying truth and reality exists and end up defining what effectively has become known as ego, which is a false self-image of self. False image of self. What's interesting about the word ego in Latin in its root is that it's really just I. And looking at that I is something I become based on what I think is a very different context than thinking of that I as who we all are based on an ever-present natural state of knowing awareness. So the division right there immediately shows how fractured thought can set off into these trillions of different options that people have come up with over time and begin to seem normal because they've been so prolific. While in fact, it's been abnormal all along, and humanity has suffered the consequences as a result of humanity's actions, starting with thought, because all action, all voluntary action begins with a thought. And those
Yeah.
choices, as you're describing, is the choice to make believe that because everybody else is doing it, there's no help in it. There's no hope in ever stopping it, when the lack of hope is actually in the thought we're having about everybody else, rather than in acknowledging it's something we're doing, period, as something I'm doing. And to any degree I do it, I feed that grid of energy, fear, anxiety, stress that seems normal because it's been done so long as to appear normal, when in fact it's anything but normal, to end up making believe that disease is normal when healing is a miracle. Our bodies are designed to maintain balance, and stress undermines their ability to do that as one of the primary acts against our own well-being, literally being well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think you're right on it. And I think that manifestation is clear, and it does indicate the freedom we have. If I can choose to be wrong and make believe it's right, that's a lot of freedom that I've been given to exercise the latitude of possibility that's possible. It doesn't mean I can ever turn that thing I think is wrong into right, but it means I can entertain it as long as I want. And generally, the more I do, the less able I become, and eventually concede it's an impossibility, because I do everything I can in terms of manifestation to express it in destructive means. I end up destroying everything around me and everyone around me in terms of my relationships, to end up feeling alone, so that I can support the contention that I am alone based on a thought that has no basis, which would be so alone as to not even exist.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's two things that are popping in my head. So hopefully we can get to both of them. But
It's like champagne.
like champagne. So the one teacher I was talking about that I'm, restudying some of her stuff, Leslie Kahn, and hers is very much what's the character thought, and what's the character thought about what just happened right before, and that kind of bleeds into your next line of dialogue. And it's interesting because there's one scene that we're working on right now, and it's like literally I can say these certain thoughts that get me to a certain energy, and I think, and it looks like on screen, like I actually have somebody really close to me who's actually sick and dying, and I need help from this particular paramedic that's in front of me. And, when the scene's done, it's done. It goes away. And it reminds me of, one of my drama school mentors, David Mamet, who's can be controversial at times. But what he did say is that really, acting is just the creation of the illusion of a character through pursuing an action, and whether that action is physical or whether it's in thought, you're still creating the illusion of a character by believing a particular type of thoughts. And it's funny is that, we don't realize outside of the drama world and plays and movies and all that stuff, we are the actual actor creating the kind of play we want to see in our everyday reality.
Very good.
So, that provides a lot of freedom. I think when people are listening to this conversation, is to see that they have that same capability to manifest what they would actually like. But at the same time, what I've been learning lately is just like, that doesn't mean like, the depression won't come up, or the thoughts that I've cultivated before that are wrong are not going to just, I don't know. And maybe you can talk to this, Jack, are not going to just go away very easily. They're not going to necessarily like it, especially if they're in a way trapped in my emotional body. Those thoughts are now trapped in my nervous system.
But think of that image, Philip.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a thought.
Yeah.
And it's a thought that they're trapped in your nervous system. So when you think about letting go of them, you think of them as something trapped in your nervous system, rather than simply seeing that right now, if you don't think it's possible to let go of them, you're stressing that same nervous system with a present thought, not one that's old, because none of the thoughts you've ever had before are still happening, but the present thought is still happening on that same basis, and repeating it. It's the same thing we do when we look out in the world and say, well, it's impossible, because how are you going to change everybody else's thinking? And I would suggest everybody else's thinking is already changing all the time, all the time, all the time, right now, all the time. It's all susceptible because it's all either being maintained by thoughts that aren't true, or it's simply expressing absolute truth and doesn't have any need to be hung on to or fought for or regretted or feel doomed over. None of it. It just is a present state of expression. And I suspect when you're talking about what other people are doing, that they are responsible for the manifestations that we are witnessing, whether they admit it or not. We're all participating in this interactive totality that we share, and that everything that's happening right now where we are is happening regardless of whether we can see it. And the fact that we don't see it and it's not as close to us as it is to maybe somebody else doesn't mean we're disconnected from it at all. It simply means that we often rely on our immediate senses to tell us where we are, forgetting that that's only senses. Those senses are literally bodily senses to tell us about our body and our body's location, not a being knowingness that I suspect isn't based in time or space, that is an absolute presence, that isn't, if it continually shows up wherever anyone seems to be willing to look for it or have it, it clearly doesn't rush around and get to where they are when they're finally willing. It's clearly ever present, regardless of their willingness and regardless of whether they look at it accurately. It's always there, always present. And beginning to see that is beginning to see that that would be the same for everyone, including all of the thoughts I have about everyone else that aren't true, but that I would use to excuse me continuing to do the thing I claim is impossible to let go of. The fact, to your point, I suspect, is that we're chronically in the present maintaining these thoughts as though they're so real that we have no other choice, because they are things we don't even admit we're doing. And again, to the point of no choice, if it were no choice, why do we use that we have no other choice as an excuse when it wouldn't be a choice at all? It would just be automatic. It would be instinctual, be happening to us rather than by us.
Yeah. So let me ask you this question about time, because I've been, as I've talked before, I've been listening to this one book, and it's interesting. I'm re-listening to it, and it's very much in line with our conversation. And it talks about how the biggest thing that kind of gets in our way is time, and we end up attracting
The book.
What?
What's the book?
It's a Happy Pocket Full of Money, and it's actually the guy. It's actually the guy who was the advisor on The Secret. So the lady who wrote the book, actually, the main advisor was this particular person, David Cameron. It's a Gikandi. He was the creative consultant on The Secret. It's a happy pocket full of money, your quantum leap into the understanding, having, and enjoying of immersed wealth and happiness. And, you know, a lot of his is about creating, reminding that time is really just a construct of the ego, and that with beingness, you can kind of manifest what you want now, but the way this is the thing that I talked about, like, it's like, he's like, have like 100 to 5,000 images of, like, if you say I am a billionaire, not saying I'm a billionaire in, 20 years, just say I'm a billionaire, and just using it in the present moment, but then creating the images of that lifestyle. How do you want it to look? All this stuff, because what will probably end up happening is you may not manifest that exact thing right now, but you could start manifesting all the different images that you're cultivating. But a lot of it, it's talking about a beingness. Like right now, the universe and the universal force behind it is abundant more than than all the money in the world right now. And so,
well, there's a great statement, Philip. So much of what we tend to imagine has to do with money.
Yes. Well, it's our current day God.
Which is, well, and it's just basically an agreement of value. And yet, if that agreement of value is not ultimately the greatest value we have, it may not be the thing we're actually manifesting on a regular basis, but actually we're missing the value in the moment by making believe it's not here. And we're developing culturally and individually a corrupt idea about what's actually happening. And what's actually happening are the things that are happening around us and externally, rather than seeing how we think of them is ultimately all we are doing about them. It's really all that we're making of them that we struggle with. And picking and choosing what we make of them is easy. There's no burden to that. But when we make believe our life depends on achieving those things and getting those things, now we're trying to make believe that what we have right now isn't everything. And if the premise of my constant seeking other things other than the fulfillment of all that I have right now, where I am with you, is any less than that, by the time I get to that place where I might even achieve some of the things I've managed, I probably won't want them, because I'll have that same sense of emptiness with them that I do now, thinking that my fullness isn't available to me.
Mm-hmm.
So my sense is that everyone is expressing an absolute present state of being everywhere they are, everywhere everything is, including inanimate objects, who seem to know exactly what to do without arguing over what they do at all, just like the trees grow in the forest for thousands of years, and they don't say, I'm bigger than you and I'm going to take everything you've got as a result because I want to preserve my future. They share the water, they share the air, they share the resources that are available to them, and they work in unison with each other. The inner turmoil that I set off by making believe I shouldn't be where I am and thinking I should only be somewhere else with something else means that I'm denying that all that I have and all that is here now. And if the present state of awareness is actually always present, and I'm constantly chronically developing ideas about how I want to be somewhere else to get something else, that what I'm really doing in that dream is denying that I'm already where I seem to want to keep getting and seem to want to keep going and seem to want to keep having, by not simply conceding it's already here. And then the question is, how do I be valuable? Doesn't mean money can't be a part of that, but it's probably not the primary essence of value. If I'm valuable in any way, there's a good chance people would be happy to give me money for the sake of just valuing the value I give them. Just like we do farmers who grow great produce. They get more money now doing things naturally than using all of the developed, highly skilled chemicals that we've come up with to try to make it easier to farm while it's less productive nutritionally. So they're going back to basics and just growing in dirt like has always happened naturally and being paid more for it because it's more valuable to people. And it's more, surprisingly, remarkably, rare that we have people actually doing things that appeal to health and nutrition rather than speed and expediency and seeming efficiency, when in fact it's a depleted form of value. And we're willing to pay for it. There's some evidence there that we understand value and recognize it and appreciate it and know it. And it's largely our design to produce things that are valuable to people because it's good for us to have everyone better rather than good for us to be better in excluding everyone else and creating enemies and isolation in the meantime and wonder why we feel like we're at risk. Ultimately, we're designed to cooperate. We were given the planet without any boundaries other than rivers and canyons that may have been seeming boundaries, but seem to have been conquered sufficiently to see most of the planet at this point. We've drawn the lines. Humans have drawn the lines that we fight over. Humans have fought over the possession of items on the basis of them being mine and not yours. And it isn't to say we can't play that game. It's a game. But to play as though our life depends on it turns it into something a little more serious and desperate than the actual natural fluidity of that generosity. Everything that's ever been here to be owned has always been here or grown since here began.
Yeah.
And that's pretty generous for it to still provide everything that we still have now and everything that we think we want now. It's all coming from the natural resources that we've all been given to share. And we're not very good at sharing. And I would say that if we can't share openly about this in words that basically evaporate once said and express the thoughts that give us the compulsive, irritated, impulsive behaviors that have us act in ways that are not friendly and not kind and not valuable to one another or ourselves, then it's probably there's not a good chance we're going to share those resources in ways that are flattering or favorable to the majority of people who are out there. And I would say that's pretty much how humanity has worked or dysfunctioned through history. So it's no more true now that humanity is incapable of reckoning with itself. We have a longer history to rely on to make believe it's impossible because it hasn't happened yet, when in fact the impossibility is in the present thought and nowhere else.
And it's funny with 12-step communities or certain spiritual or religious communities, you end up learning and you get to a certain point where you realize it's actually better to be of service and help others at a certain point. Obviously, you have to take care of yourself first, but after that, one of the biggest tools to get out of your own mental obsession is to listen and help other people. And I would say some of the best people in whatever field they're at with the highest integrity, who have done maybe the best monetarily, are usually figuring out ways how they can be of greater service to those that they serve or potential people, the greater population. You know what I mean? Like when I'm doing a film or TV series, it's not necessarily, okay, what can I get about this? And, what fame can I get out of this? And da, da, da. It's like, okay, I believe in this particular story because it talks about this particular type of truth of dealing with life and going through life. And how can I best be of service to the story? How can I best be of service to the writer, the producer, the casting director, to my other actors? And, kind of giving up, like, if I'm the best person to help this story, I'm there to be of service, and hopefully, I'll get cast in the end to do that. And the truth is, I might not be. And if I don't get this role, then there's another place where I can be of service. And I think a lot of people in the 12-step community who've learned how to take that to even their general professions have experienced, a certain type of grace. And I'm sure you've experienced it, Jack, but a certain thing where things just tend to flow.
Well, to act in accordance with how things are is to begin to see how things are. And my sense is even having to consider its service indicates that we consider the natural state of things as not serving others. Because if we were actually acting in a fully realized, fully actualized basis, it wouldn't seem like service at all, because we'd recognize it's the absolute best thing we can do for ourselves, to have everyone better off. I mean, imagine if everybody in the world was completely productive and happy and satisfied and fulfilled with what they were doing. They wouldn't be thinking about how much more they could have. They would be thinking about how much more they could give, because the satisfaction of that is much greater than the having of something and sitting alone in a 40-room mansion wondering where all your friends and family are. And it's not uncommon that people that get everything they want isolate and insulate and marginalize the relationships they have along the way in the name of thinking it's the best thing they can do. It isn't healthy to put our relationships at risk in the name of something we think is good for us.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the freedom to do it is absolutely free, but the recognition, my sense is, Philip, that what you're describing when people start to act in favor of others is it offers us the same perspective that we try to use to blame people for what we're feeling and thinking when we want to escape what we're thinking and feeling. We use them to excuse what we're doing because we blame them for what we're doing, rather than admit that our own contempt for them is actually our own awareness that what we're doing is wrong, and we're seeing them through the lens of the wrong thinking that we're doing. And in that same regard, when we start serving others, it gives us perspective and something in us that we act blind to, which is that sense of fulfillment and that sense of value and that sense of completeness and wholeness and usefulness. we just act blind to that while we're blaming other people, because if we were admitting what we were doing, we would be thanking them for offering us the insight and the perspective to see that what we were seeing in them is actually what we were doing, rather than what we thought we were seeing so clearly about them while we were still struggling internally with our own conflict. And that sort of collision becomes obvious when we act accurately to what's happening. Like, for instance, when you're taking any outward action, it never happens at any other time than the present. So if you sweep a sidewalk, it's fulfilling because every time you move that broom, something happens in relation to what you'd like to see done. And that's productivity. That's how things work. There's nothing that's ever happened outside of me that happened because I thought it should or shouldn't in terms of a direct action. I may influence people. I may be part of a grid of fear that they're sensing that doesn't help them produce better. But when it comes down to eating, it's something that requires an external effort. My hand, finding food, getting it to my mouth, chewing it, swallowing it, doing all those things. And to think in terms that are inaccurate and not notice that we have a very good Geiger counter or GPS system telling us what's wrong by simply acknowledging we know it when it's happening and start to say, oh, this thought I'm having must be based on something that really has no basis for me to be feeling so awkward or uncertain or doubtful, or all of a sudden contemptful of others and fearful, because I'm admitting what I'm doing, not what I'm actually seeing. I'm seeing what I'm seeing to justify continuing to do what I'm doing and make believe I'm not doing what I'm doing, because the things I'm thinking, I think I'm not thinking, are the things I'm fighting and trying to keep down by preoccupying my attention out there, which in service can also be someone who goes around and does everything for everybody else as a chance to distract themselves for what they're not doing accurately within themselves.
Yeah.
And it's probably better to do that than beat people up and steal from them. But in the same form, it's a form of theft. And it's a form of corruption. And it's a form of disingenuous, dishonest expression. And that is the arena, in my estimation, of this discussion, because it starts to, rather than put what we do superficially on display, starts to allow us to see what we don't think is happening because we think it's hidden, and start to actually realize it's never been hidden at all, because it's been expressing itself through us in anxious struggles, emotional turmoil, dysfunctional relationships, expectations that never seem met to be met, and all the other kind of frustrations that are so seemingly typical to average everyday life. When in fact, if you look at those things accurately and realize how consistent they are, you begin to realize, if I keep thinking this way, I'm probably going to keep having those exact situations, and they're perfectly designed to tell me what's wrong, not designed to help me figure out how to get over them and overcome them and gain more confidence and ambition to run them over. But simply say, wow, that's good information right now for what I'm doing right now. And if I begin to get used to that, all of a sudden the present moment doesn't seem to be that awkward. It becomes very stable and very, very constant, and the thinking certainly stabilizes, because it's not thinking about things that aren't happening. It begins to actually concede, oh, if it's happening, I'm doing it. I'm at the center of it. If I didn't exist, there would be no center to witness things from. And the existence of my body is a metaphor for my ultimate presence and that present awareness. That present awareness doesn't debate because it doesn't think, it just knows. And if what it knows is right and true and real, then it knows clearly what's wrong when I'm thinking ways that do not express it. And if I deny that, I am the cause of the conflicts I create by continuing to pursue the ideas as though they're right and real. And I need to force them on people and others to convince everybody that I'm right and real, or live in fear and isolation so that I don't have any contest and claim that my isolation confirms that, in fact, everything I'm thinking is correct.
So I'm curious, Jack, When did you start to notice in your own life, and you kind of started hitting more onto like the mental obsession of like, there was something array, there was something wrong, and you started to investigate below the surface of things that were happening, especially in your thought life and, the physical life around you?
I mean, I was troubled when I was 4 years old. My mother told me not to play with matches, and I had the pond bed in the forest behind our house on fire within 24 hours. And then, in perfect natural order to doing something wrong, I ran back and forth to the house from the forest with a baby bottle, filling it with water and running out there and pouring it on it and running back to the house. And rather than asking my mother for help, I was doing everything I could to hide what I knew was wrong. And clearly the fire was good evidence because it was growing. And she put it out with a garden hose eventually and just sort of shook her head. So in asking that, my sense is we've all known all along. We've just struggled with how to manage this knowledge in a way that resolves it. And the lack of resolution has constantly created these defective conclusions that give us ideas about who we think we are that aren't true. And as a result, who we think everyone else is that's challenging us that aren't true, and live in this decayed condition of scarcity rather than this incredible abundance that we've all been given that's never gone away, that's never been anywhere else than where we are. We just haven't been good at expressing it in an interactive level. And when we're interreacting, we're basically using everyone else to, and what I did as a kid was trouble everybody around me because I felt troubled. I caused trouble and felt that them being perplexed at least put me on fair ground with them because I was perplexed too. Very young, I was perplexed. And I don't suspect my first drink at 14 would have given me any relief if there wasn't something I was already struggling from to get relief from. My first two drinks were 2 8-ounce glasses of whiskey. One was scotch, one was bourbon. And that's a lot of whiskey to drink the first time you've ever drank. So I didn't have any craving for it. But there was something in me that told me this could help my problem. This could solve my problem. I saw adults laughing and having fun in ways that they didn't seem to have fun when they were paying attention to me. But with each other, they seemed to have fun. And something told me there was something there. So my sense is it's not something any of us are lacking in. It's something we all know. And we wouldn't be depressed and we wouldn't feel wrong and we wouldn't feel low self-esteem if we didn't know better. Those things would all be high points of our experience. And we would feel fulfilled by those things because they would be reaching the ends of our potential rather than beginning to see that the ends of any potential I think I have is really the beginning of everything else. Just like the horizon. As long as that was thought to be the end, it was thought to be doomed. And thought that people would die. And really, it was an awareness of humans to know that their thought was doomed because it had no basis that caused the idea that the edge was the doom. It was blaming the horizon for appearing to be doomed when it was the thought about the horizon that was doomed. So I think that awareness has always been there. I just don't think we've talked about it openly. And if that knowing presence is known, then it's something we all know. We may not think we know it, and we may not think we can express it, and we may have all sorts of other ideas, but I would say that is clearly an addiction to thinking. Thinking is the source of our experience because the impact it can have on us can manifest what seems real because it hurts. And it's interesting that we use pain to justify something being real when in fact pain is the body's indicator for what's wrong. So we see it as something to get away from, rather than recognize that if we're causing it, we're asking for it. We're actually being given good guidance to say, hey, you don't have to continue this. It hurts because what you're doing is wrong. And if you keep stepping deeper into the fire and wonder why you continue to burn, which is what happens with obsessive thinking, we burn ourselves and others with that kind of thinking. If you continue to step into it, you're just asking for more and more pain to finally come to terms with the fact that pain doesn't confirm reality or truth. It confirms something is wrong. Period. So when we mistake what we're witnessing, we act in ways that are mistaken and end up with misgivings.
It's interesting. I was talking to someone earlier today, and they were talking about how, one of the reasons they write is because they're curious about what's the thought behind the thought,
Yeah,
the thought, because everything in the linear plane, we think this is the thought we're having. It's not really that thought, but it's the thought underneath it that's really a whole we're beholden to, or has a hold of us. And that to me reminds me, to when I was a kid, like, I was always I was always had this propensity that I wanted to prove my thoughts and other people's thoughts wrong. I knew there
yes.
was something deeper than that I wanted to just, just prove them wrong. And
Express.
What?
You wanted to express. It sounded like you
Yeah,
were on the verge of saying.
yeah, I wanted to express that. And I think even with, you saying that about the fire and the pool and all that stuff, it's like there was still a certain propensity underneath that you wanted to experience whatever it was. Maybe was that anxiety of putting the fire out. So one day you would actually
Exactly.
know that you could put the fire out.
Right.
um,
What's interesting with the addictive messes is we can never put them out because we make sure that they're beyond our control because they're actually evidencing and manifesting something. If something doesn't exist, it's out of control because it literally has no control because there isn't anything to control.
mhm,
And the delusion of the thinking is that there's something there to control and maintain when in fact it's the thinking itself trying to deny the thinking it's doing that's trying to maintain itself.
mhm,
So think of the way you just described this idea that these thoughts are buried, and I use that too, and probably incorrectly.
mhm,
But if the thought that I have buried is actually buried, where is the thinking coming from that it could be buried when I'm thinking about it presently as being buried? It's the present thought about the thought that I'm using to justify my present thought as incapable of doing it because this other thing is buried somewhere else.
mhm,
So if the present is always present and knowing is always knowing where we are, it's never anything more than we're making out of it now, even when we think it's the subconscious, which I would suggest is where historically this underlying motives have been seemingly kept.
mhm,
But if we're reacting in ways that acknowledge those underlying motives, those reactions are admitting we are aware of those motives.
mhm,
And what do we do with what's most obvious? Ignore it. And what do we do with what we can't see? Pretend it's everything going on. And that's exactly how a lie operates. Claims to be exactly what it isn't. A lie isn't a lie any longer than it maintains the premise that it's true. So it claims to be the only thing it can't be. And when it's simply admitted as being what it is, it disappears because there is nothing there. And you can see where the opposing inner turmoil comes from in the chronic nature of maintaining this thinking, that any chronic thinking we're doing is maintaining something that doesn't exist except in thought. And we think if we stop thinking about it, we're going to die because the ego we think we are is wrapped up in all those thoughts. And where are those thoughts? Present, now, here, always. They aren't somewhere else. Now, it isn't to suggest the body doesn't take a hit by maintaining that stress, because it does. And the body today, wherever we are, everything is the sum total of everything that's ever happened anywhere that anything has ever happened. Everything on earth throughout the universe right now is the sum total of everything that's ever happened, including our body. And if we've been maintaining this chronic condition and have never taken our foot off the gas to say, oh, this is an option, this is a choice that I'm free to make. And if I feel condemned by it, I'm making a choice that's wrong and then denying my complicity in it because it would be absurd to continue to do the thing I know I shouldn't do and end up doing it chronically as though it's the only thing I should do or can do. That's insanity. So we carry those messages very often in those stories we tell about the thoughts and the burial, and they're here and they're not there, and they're in the past. And all those things give us a sense of incapacity and impossibility, that there's anything we can do about it now, because everything that isn't happening somewhere else where it can't be warrants, through the stories we tell, that I can't do anything right now. And all I do right now is maintain my old opinions by repeating and repeating and repeating and chronically feeding those stories, which is the mental obsession, and stressing my body and using the stress to justify I must be right because I'm feeling wrong, and that something out there must be wrong that I need to right, when in fact it's my own wrong that I'm unwilling to admit I'm trying to make right, that will never be right. And that's the freedom, is saying, oh, our knowing nature has never been unknowing, and it's never been wrong. It is our actions we've chosen that are wrong. It is our thoughts we've chosen that are wrong. It is something we're doing, not something we are. And that suggests that we have a greater awareness of what's going on. And I would suggest that greater awareness is exactly what we are able to recognize, delineates or contrasts what we recognize as being wrong in our thinking. We wouldn't know what's wrong if we were wrong naturally. It would be right. And it would be the only thing we could do. And it wouldn't be a choice. It would just be our nature. And humans have lived with stories about our nature being wrong.
Which kind of, it's funny, it leads us back to the beginning of that thing of people saying, I had no choice.
Yes.
I had no choice but to do this. Yeah. Going back to the that guy I was talking about that I'm reading the book, he also talks about the idea of, and I think it's very similar to what we're talking about, is that usually pain and suffering is an indication of something is wrong in our thinking or choices. You know, suffering doesn't happen when we make the right choices.
Choice is always a thought. Choice is always a thought too.
Yeah. Yeah. But would you say that if we were choosing the right things, we probably wouldn't be suffering pain? We wouldn't be experiencing pain and suffering? Is that kind of the like the real way for us to kind of go through daily life of understanding, okay, this type of thought is good, this thought is right, this thought is wrong, this action's right, this action's wrong, is usually the indication we feel in our body of pain or suffering?
Well, I think the pain and suffering gives us an indication of what we're thinking for sure. And, you know, you made the point earlier that this probably doesn't go away immediately when you start looking at it. The thoughts don't go away. And my suspicion is that what happens immediately is when we start actually looking at this accurately, we start to see the disturbance that we've been creating and the ideas that we've been holding that we haven't even been thinking that we've been holding, that are very disturbing. And being disturbed when you're looking at something disturbing is an accurate response to what's happening. That's one that's gainful enough to witness what's happening accurately so that there's something you can do about it. If I think the disturbance is something to deny and escape, what am I going to do about it? Pretend it's not there because I've gotten over it. I've gone somewhere else. And a lot of times those right choices I make are simply choices to create immediate, temporary, compulsive satisfaction through the immediacy of making believe that I can escape the thing I'm continuing to do by not thinking I'm doing it. But to your broader question, I would suggest that there's a lot of things we do during the day that we really don't question. When we're hungry, we eat. We don't sit around and say, am I really hungry? How much longer can I go before I'm really hungry? We generally just sort of serve the needs that we feel we have, right? So those, you can make all kinds of decisions in that process, right? And they all serve, for the most part, that purpose. The question is, if we're eating poor quality food, are we really giving our body what it needs? And I would say no. And so some of those actions that can seem right are actually leading to, they're giving us immediate satisfaction when in fact they're creating a longer term consequence that we're not even paying attention to because it's not happening immediately. And though I would suggest when we eat poorly, we know it because we don't particularly feel good. It may taste good, but as soon as it's in us, it feels bloated and like something's occupying us that doesn't necessarily belong in us. So it's a very thin line. And my experience is that if there's one right way to do things, that means everything else is wrong. And largely what we choose then would be wrong, with the option of constantly correcting and adjusting to stay on some semblance of a course that would be meaningful enough and efficient enough to be productive enough to utilize the abundance we have to have more than we need so that we have more to give and function on a way that's very, very generous, rather than one that is so crippled by our own shortcomings that we have so little to give that we're constantly draining other people for what they have, in this kind of self-pitiful cry that we have that if you really care about me, you'll help me, when in fact the help is actually causing us to get worse, which comes to enabling, which is ultimately the primary issue and the disease. And my sense is, Philip, that we often enable ourselves in our own thinking to do things that seem immediately satisfying but don't have any long-term value. Because anything we learn, like math, if you learn 2 + 2 is 2, you don't need to go through the whole construction of how you got there once you know it. You just begin to apply it. And the difference between obsessive thoughts and accurate thoughts is that when we do anything that's accurate, we know we can do that anytime, and the natural laws of the universe will respond. They're just, we know when we put a foot in front of another, we're going to get 3 feet ahead or 2.5 feet ahead. We have confidence that there's a lot of activities that we can do, and we don't struggle with those things. We struggle with these thoughts about things that are impossible and then completely misproportionately apply it to the universe as being wrong or impossible because we're maintaining a thought that's impossible because we want to escape the culpability for admitting I'm responsible, period. If you follow me.
Yeah, I follow you. It's been my experience when I do accept responsibility for that thinking or those choices, things tend to they may initially feel bad, worse, pain. But once I do that and I go through it, things do tend to get better.
Well, about responsibility, it's an absolute state of being. If we didn't exist, we would have no responsibility. So our existence confirms responsibility. So it isn't something we can take or give, but you're making the point that if you think you can take it and feel better, it means that you've mistaken it many times and felt worse by making believe you weren't responsible. So the point of that is to say that if we're each responsible, the beauty of it is, at first it seems like I'm responsible, and that means that nobody else is at fault. Nothing anybody else did should affect me and all that kind of stuff, that I'm letting everybody else off the hook. But in fact, if it's an absolute state of being, we share it just like we share that present state of knowing. And if I begin to see that in others and realize that they're responsible too, and I'm responsible wholly, not in a divisive manner where I've got 2% and they've got 98% because there's 100 people that we're trying, or 50 people we're trying to divide responsibility up. We've all got 100% because in an absolute state, nothing is divisible. If I start operating on that basis and seeing it that way, I don't feel like I'm letting anyone off the hook. I'm actually beginning to realize that they've never been on the hook, that the nature of life and this life form we're experiencing it through is responsible, period, not by taking or giving. And as I begin operating on that basis, I begin acting in that way. And if I'm thinking in that way, I'm not causing those opinions in others to get worse and refining it by participating with them in that conspiracy. I'm simply concluding it, operating on that basis. And I would suggest it's how we've always operated. We've just been doing acrobats with thoughts and gymnastics with complexity to try to make believe that the confusion we claim to have justifies us not knowing better, when in fact we've known all along, and we're simply trying to use thinking to come to a conclusion that we absolutely know things based on thought, rather than we absolutely know things and then we have the chance to express them in and with thought. Thoughtfulness is actually the full expression of what thought's designed to do. Thoughtlessness is removing the substance from thought and asking and wondering why it isn't working. It's like gratefulness. When we recognize the greatness we are full of, we begin to express through our thinking and choices that fullness and that greatness naturally. So we become grateful naturally because we see the interconnectedness has never left us. We've always been well-versed in what's happening. We've always been in the know. We've just been acting like we weren't to justify the putrid, corrupt ideas that we have that aren't true. Which is where mentally obsessive thinking seems to live.
Yep.
It's never more than what we make of it now. And if that's all it ever is, it isn't anything other than what we make of it. And if truth and reality are true and real, they're never obstructed by it at all. And there's no truth or reality to find because it's always been wherever we are, always and always will be. It can't be anywhere else because it doesn't operate in space and time. It's just present for everything, always, everywhere. Probably beyond the confines of the universe, which is probably the universe ends up being no more than a thought. Something imagined within the context of an absolute infinite array of possibilities.
We're the meaning makers.
Or the mean makers by making believe what we mean means me getting mean to make it.
Yeah.
So it's a discussion, and my experience is it's enlightening all the time in the sense that it reveals the potential for darkness and the ideas of obstruction and the self-imposed ramifications to have my experience appear to make it real when in fact I'm creating the experience to justify it being real, when in fact reality doesn't need any justification, neither does truth, neither does love as an essence. It's just a natural state of being. It's an ever-present, generous, ever-giving, never offended because it's not defensive. It doesn't have a self to think of because it doesn't think of itself. It simply knows, and knowing never doubts. It never questions because it's not in doubt. There is no question. Something that's absolute is just absolutely a present state of being that we all share. And not only all of us share as humans, but all things share that same platform, regardless of the design of their making.
It reminds me, at least for me this week, and maybe this is a good way to wind down the conversation today, is I had a couple points, I think it was Wednesday and yesterday, where my mental obsession and self-pity thoughts were very high, at a high frequency, bouncing around my head. And the saving thought that came to me was, I've done transcendental meditation for a few years. And on Wednesday, I decided, you know what? Nothing's going to be served right now or concluded. So let me go to the Palisade Park in Santa Monica and sit on a bench and meditate during the sunrise. And literally within 20 minutes, the self-pity, the fear, or whatever I was feeling dissipated. And it was like I woke up. It was like what had occurred before was not to any degree of how I felt it before I started meditating. And, some things flowed, like, I had an audition come in, and then, it became very clear what my path was of what I needed to do for at least that rest of that day. So that was interesting. And then yesterday, I was just obsessing about a certain situation and getting a certain email. And I knew my head was just getting crazy, and nothing I would do to act on those thoughts was going to make the situation better. So I just decided to go to a meeting. And and while I was in that meeting, I meditated for 20 minutes, just listening to other people, doing my mantra at the same time, just breathing. And then by the end of those 20 minutes and by the end of the meeting, I was in completely different space. The email that I wanted to come in came in. I mean, I actually had to shut off my phone and put it on airplane mode because it was just too much. Like, even if it buzzed, every buzz, I'd be like, is that the email? Is that the email? And on the way home, I got to experience at least the fruits for this particular week of things that have gone successful. I was able to just enjoy that success. So I was actually rather happy.
Like, okay, now I'm a mentor for you.
So no, it's okay. But it's just interesting that, like, how that one practice just completely interrupted everything that I was thinking and feeling and putting into definitive terms and all that stuff. It just stopped. And I think it stopped because of I tapped in, not that I tapped in, but that presence overtook any obsessive thoughts that I was thinking.
But your obsessive thoughts never overtook the presence.
No, I just gave my attention to it more.
Exactly. So it's interesting how simple the words we use reveal the thoughts we have, and how the thoughts we have about it are so based on thought that we think in terms and express in terms as though what we think is reality, when in fact a present state of being and awareness is always there. It's always where we are. It's always where everything is, for everyone, not just me, not just you, for us and all things that are and all things that is. It's just there. It's just the nature of life. It is life. The idea that it's rare shows how addictive we've been to this line of thinking, when in fact it's the most common thing we share. And
Addiction.
The ever-present state of being is the most common thing we share, while the addiction has been used so chronically for seemingly so long to give us the impression that it's something rare and unusual, which it can't be. It's actually our common nature right now.
So how would I, and maybe say someone who's listening, use languaging more from the ever lasting presence versus the mental obsessive thought process, ego center?
Self-centered thoughts serve themselves, and it's a master-slave relationship. You create the thought and then pretend to be a victim to the thought. So you become the slave to the thought when you're actually the creator of the thought, and you go round and round in circles and think that somehow, someday it's going to straighten out, when in fact it can only feed on itself, because it's a dog chasing its tail, and a dog would be much more able to grab its tail if it stayed still than if it were running from itself. Okay, so that's just a thought. The two thoughts that you gave me in the last 10 days or so that occurred to you was, first of all, when you were in your obsessive thinking, you conceded that this is only a thought. It's just a thought that's going on. And what the content of that thought that seems so real and true when you're entertaining it is really just what we're filling that thought with. It's what we're thinking about. And I will guarantee you, at all times when you're thinking obsessively, you are thinking about something that is not happening. And you know why? Because everything that's happening does not need to be thought of to be happening. It's happening despite what we think. Why? Because it was happening before humans were even on Earth, and before there was even an Earth to think of. So we're dealing with the realm of existence here, not just some convenient practical thing to get by and figure out how to get a job and a career and end up with enough to live on when we're in retirement. It's beginning to recognize the bounty of life is the ever-present state of our natural awareness wherever we are all the time. So that was the one thing that you had said to me in the last, I think, 10 days or so. The second thing was that awareness that thoughts aren't real and they aren't true. And that follows the first idea that it's just simply a thought. And if I'm choosing to think it, I can always unchoose, because a choice always allows not to be chosen. Always. That's what choice is about. Choice is about being able to choose anything possible to choose or not choose anything. And the idea of addiction is there's no other choice. And if it were no other choice, why would we use choice? It wouldn't be a choice. And yet we use choice to blame it because the sick thinking has it now become this perverted thing that allows us no other choice because we're now being beaten by the thought we've created as the master, and we're acting like the slave because it's incomprehensible to us to do this and consider it sane, when in fact it's the most insane thing we can do, and we've suffered from it through history and make believe somehow it's not us, it's everyone else, everywhere else. And in fact, it's happening right now. So when you ask the question I would generally ask is, why do we continue to make believe it's not possible here?
Mm-hmm.
Why do we continue to promote the idea that we need to do something? Is because we're so reliant on thinking. We think it's up to thinking to conclude that all there is based on what we think. And if we don't understand it, it isn't happening. And all of science is perfect proof that for all they understand, they still have huge questions about what's happening, even within the confines of what is accepted to be true within science. And even science recognizes that there are faults within the whole understanding of gravity. We don't even understand gravity yet. And yet the gravity of our situation seems so compelling as to only continue to think about it rather than recognize the impression that we create is depressing enough to give us the impression that because we're suffering, it's real and true, rather than recognize that the thinking we're doing is not real and true at all. And that's exactly why we're depressed over it. We know better. So for an audience or you, it's just to begin to concede that knowing presence is always knowing, wherever you are. So whatever you're doing, when you went to the park and just sat in an environment that wasn't conducive to thinking more about those thoughts you were thinking of when you were alone, all of a sudden nature is a great thing to witness and say, oh, wow, look at the trees, look at the wind, look at the ocean. Start to actually interact with things that are doing what they're doing exactly as they're doing it, is confirming to that sense of presence. So our accuracy in thinking, beginning to actually look at the thinking and simply say, as you did, that's just a thought. I'm just having a thought. And if the thought is filled with content that I'm unhappy with, being discontent would be normal because it's really an empty, there's nothing there other than the substance I claim to be giving it. And if I'm giving nothing substance, I'm lying about what it actually is, unless I'm simply seeing that I'm making it up. And when I do, like actors, like you were describing, it's easy to have a character. It's easy to choose a character and act it out. It's difficult to make believe that a character becomes who I actually am, when in fact it isn't. It's just a choice. It's a thought.
So my question still remains, Jack. I understand what you're saying, though it doesn't particularly answer what kind of languaging can I use to speak and express myself more from the beingness versus the thought focus presence.
So let's look at that. Okay. Would the confusion be coming from a sense of absolute awareness, or would the confusion in your question be coming from doubt in your own thinking?
Well, obviously the latter.
Okay. So if the doubt is coming from thinking and you're asking to appeal to the thinking that's irrational with new information, how's that thinking going to treat that new information? It's going to think it's preposterous and dismiss it. So the awareness is beginning to recognize that your awareness isn't based in thinking. Your awareness is based in an ever-present knowing that you've always been aware of, that has never been in doubt, and that has always been certain and has always been with you. And you have just chronically been not paying attention to, making believe that all the attention you have should be consumed with the intoxication of your toxic thinking. And intoxication includes that word, not coincidentally. And that poison thread will somehow be extinguished by understanding what we're doing better, rather than conceding what we're doing is wrong in its simplest form, and begin to say, I know more than I think. I know right now absolutely what knowledge would know. I know it. and simply begin to concede in the simplest forms rather than the complexity, again, of trying to undo and unravel all the darkness disappears when the light goes on. It doesn't argue with it. It doesn't decide which part of it's going to come or go. When your knowing awareness is conceded, since it already is, it doesn't even take your concession. But when you begin to concede it, what you're doing is introducing to thought that thought is subsequent to it and a product of it rather than the creator of it or the conclusive nature of it. And then the knowing becomes natural. Intuition is knowledge beyond reason. It means reason is useless when it comes to this form of knowledge, which is ultimately knowledge. So here's the question for you in your answer to complete the circle. If you can sit for 20 minutes meditating, what is it you find when you meditate?
Nothing.
But what do you get? What's your experience?
Usually bliss or some feeling tone of greater than you're thinking that puts everything at ease.
Yeah. And isn't generally when you're meditating, you close your eyes?
Yeah.
So you're not distracted by sensations. The eyes are probably the most sensitive organ in terms of what we rely on to explain the external world. So it kind of puts your thoughts to sleep a little bit.
Yeah, because yeah,
isn't that thing you witnessed always there whenever you look?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So let's talk about this as an awakened meditation. My experience is that we're always awake. We just don't think we are because we keep relying on thinking to prove we're awake when thinking can't prove something that it isn't. Thinking isn't designed to prove reality. Thinking is designed to express reality and truth. That's its job. That's our job. And if we all share that, when we interact on that basis, the things we would do automatically would be appealing, beneficial, and favorable to everyone because they're in everyone's favor. And they're for everyone's benefit, not just mine and yours, but we're starting to act in ways that actually express the nature of our existence rather than the unnatural, repetitious nature of obsessive thinking. So if your awareness is all, when you go looking for something, I assure you, you will always find it. If you close your eyes and expect to have relief, you will find it because it's always there. And if you open your eyes and think you're confused about what's going on and look for solution with thought, you will find misunderstanding and confusion and consternation and dissatisfaction and disbelief and hopelessness and all that kind of stuff because you're looking with your eyes to do not what they can't do, but you're asking them to do what's already been done. It's already complete. It's already whole. It's already present. It's already here. It's already now, period. There's nothing to do about this at all. And so the point you made early in this discussion about it not going away quickly, my experience is that when I started looking, I started seeing some very disturbing ideas I had that I was very upset about. And it began to move. I felt like icebergs were melting and my tears are salty. Is a scent. Icebergs are generally in the ocean, right? So they're salty. They're actually fresh water melting into the ocean, typically. My sense was those icebergs were beginning to melt because I was warming, looking at them honestly and giving them attention rather than denying them and pretending they weren't there, where I got icy and cold and numb and made believe that my job in life was to not be affected by everything rather than to notice that I'm a sentient being and sensitive and aware and conscious of what's going on at a human level. And I've been struggling to deny it on that human level because I couldn't simply concede that it already existed in perfect order. I thought it was up to me to figure out and come to the right conclusion about.
That description reminded me of an ex.
Well, I would say she's present.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful. That's very helpful because that even reminds me sometimes when I'm working out or lifting weights, when I close my eyes, usually it's like, if I got to do 15 reps of whatever, say a bench press of, 150. And it's like, the first 10 are easy, but those last those last five, sometimes the closing of my eyes and the release of a sound will get me through the rest of those last five. Whether if I had my eyes open, I probably could only get one or two done. You know, it's funny how when you close your eyes, it's just it's easier to get in. It's easier to get in touch with that part of you that has more to give.
Well, keep in mind, we've been appealing to thought so long. When you begin to simply concede that everything is in perfect order and you know it, just in that form, you were asking for what do I do in my thinking? Mm-hmm. If you begin to concede this, you begin to concede it based on the fact that you thought you could fight it. And you thought that you could map it out and have it the way it is by thinking about it, when in fact thinking, again, is designed to express it, not be the concluder of it. It isn't designed to come to the understanding. Science has looked hard for the answers and keeps looking. And there's people all over that keep looking. I guarantee you and all of them that everything they're looking for is happening right now as it's happening, without doubt, without uncertainty, and with a form of perfection that, if simply allowed to be recognized, would allow them to express it in ways that it would become more obvious than feel like it's something that's oblivious that needs to be found within the billions of possibilities of process and eliminate or trial and error, process of elimination.
Yeah.
And the idea that it's hidden is a lie. It isn't hidden. Everything that's happening right now is happening everywhere that it's happening. Everywhere. At the outer reaches of the universe, everything is happening as it's happening right now. No different. And now I can confuse it by thinking I need to understand it before I can say that it's really happening, because I now have my own reality. Why would I need to conclude reality if it's already real? That would seem to me like I'm thinking something is incumbent on me rather than I am incumbent on it, and begin to concede things in the natural order and see that the natural order is the order of things in the entire universe. And disorders are clear indications of thinking things are out of order that are not out of order, but admitting our thinking is out of order and not wanting to simply concede that what we're doing is what's causing the disturbance. Nothing more or less than that. Nothing. Mm-hmm. So our capacity, if we're at a point that seems to be a turning point where we need to come to terms with what's going on in our universe or our world, our atmosphere, because of these catastrophic things that everybody is telling us are going to happen, and we're on the way toward with very little effort to do anything about them other than topical big claims as usual to say, oh, we're gonna come to terms with what's going on, while in fact things seem to be getting worse, and it's a good indication we're not doing quite what we could be doing. Then each of us is responsible for that. And to the degree that I see it as impossible, I make sure that I will see what I think. And I will participate in a way that contributes in that direction so that I can say, see, I told you so. I was right. When in fact, what I was right about was being wrong. And that whole idea has been lost on humanity. We're looking to move into outer space and colonize space while we haven't given ourselves the headspace we need to think clearly and express ourselves fully. And we imagine that somehow that's going to solve our problem, when in fact we're continuing to create the problem we're claiming to want to solve. That's addiction. That's insanity. That's thinking the problem is the solution and the solution is the problem. It's twisted, it's backward, and it's a possibility. And yet it absolutely has no impact on reality and truth. It just simply impacts our human experience and diminishes our human capacity to do all that we're able to do while we're disabled, crippled under the weight of making believe that we can do what we can't do, which is to tell the truth as though the truth needs to be told anything by us.
Well, I will just say one thing. I didn't say how do I figure it out in my thinking. How do I express it in my languaging? So in what I speak.
Your languaging is an expression of your thoughts, Philip. Just like your feelings are an expression of your thoughts and your action are an expression of your thoughts. All of those things start with a thought, every one of them. Anything we do that involves an option of choice starts with a thought.
Even if I'm doing an Indian rain dance?
What's that?
Even if I'm doing an Indian rain dance or mantras, I feel like
But
those
you're
come
choosing
from,
those.
I am choosing those, but they do
Yes.
feel like they're from a deeper source than my archaic, just like language here, you know,
Well, they probably don't fuel the language that you've chronically used to commit to the idea that you're not where you are. And so I would say that would be accurate in any activity that we do that's productive.
hmm,
Whenever you're engaged in interacting with something outside of you and you see, go get gas, and if you get gas, there's a satisfaction in having accomplished something, even at these prices. So what you're talking about is if you immerse yourself in doing something other than what you're doing that's chronically thinking wrong, certainly you'd feel better.
yeah,
But if it's a topical solution for a rash and the disease is the instigation of that need to do those things to feel better, begin to recognize that it's the thinking we don't think we're even thinking that's really causing the problem. And by conceding that, you can start looking at it and saying, wow, if my experience and words are telling me that something's wrong, I must be thinking something that's wrong. And just begin to concede that the nature of our own consequences is telling us exactly what we're doing and what we consider to be beneath the surface or something we're not aware of. We're aware of it enough to sense it. We're aware enough to feel it. We're aware enough to talk about it, but we don't seem aware enough to let our words actually concede that when they speak in terms that are untrue, we're thinking in terms that are untrue. And when we feel things that are bad, we're thinking things that are bad. These are human experiences created by a body to guide us, not designed to beat ourselves into submission or suicide or addictive suicide and overdoses. Those are all examples of trying to escape this rather than concede it and begin to admit, wow, I got a pretty well-designed system working on my behalf that I can as easily recognize as good guidance as I can to pretend that it means something I should be running from. By making believe it's so true and real, I can actually run from it, while any running I do, I take it with me wherever I go.
Well, I think that's at the point usually in these conversations between you and I that I say,
You need a nap.
I'm tapped out. I have to regenerate and come back to the conversation later because I will start unlearning what I've learned.
But let me, on that point, you can't unlearn something that's absolute because you can't learn it. You've always known it. And again, language starts to reveal how we rely on thought to make believe we need to think it's true for it to be true. And we need to imagine it's true before it is true. And just start to say, oh, if it's true, it's true. And I have always known it. And that, in my experience, sat me on my heels and had me sit still for a long time saying, oh, I don't have to think about this all to know it. And all of a sudden, the knowing became a lot more accessible and the language became more accessible because I wasn't planning on saying it. I was just expressing what was available in the moment and the interaction. And it's not always accurate, Philip. I don't claim to have this down in such a way as to be so refined as to never swerve or vary from that center line. But the ability to correct and adjust and recalibrate is the course, I suppose, we're on, just like a sailor at sea, in going where we go and getting where we go. It's that adjustment that makes the difference, not feeling like we're only on one course and we have to get there or our life is not worth anything. It's the adjusting along the way that gives us the chance to, we're spinning in space right now at 1,000 miles an hour. Just the rotation of the earth has us going at 1,000 miles an hour and we think we're unmovable. We think we're not moving because we're moving with all of the things. It's not true.
Yeah.
So beginning to see that as an awakened state is beginning to have an awakened awareness. My sense is our thoughts are our prayers, our choices are our prayers, and we manifest exactly what supports the thoughts we decide to maintain. And if our thoughts are right, we begin to see we've always had the abundance. We've always had everything. We just haven't been very good at expressing it. And as a result, we've lived in scarce ideas that have threatened us because the thoughts we had are threats to our existence, threats to our human existence, not to our absolute existence. But so in that, what are a couple of questions we can leave for whoever comes next, including you, if you want to come back again and we continue this? which you're welcome to do.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks, Jack. I might have to talk to my agent at this point and have them get back to you.
Your secret.
My secret agent. So the thing I'm really going to leave with, and I think I'm just going to have it as a mantra throughout the week, is I know more than what I'm thinking.
Yes.
And I also want to watch my languaging through the week. And so if it's me or somebody else, watching the languaging in which they use to express themselves on a daily basis, just having that extra awareness behind it and writing down the way that they, how they express things and seeing, is it, languaging used to more justify the thoughts and that, that story or that thing, or is it connected to beingness? Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, there's a more concise way to say it specifically, but just the practice of being aware of what we're saying and where is the center of that expression? Is it beingness or is it thought, mental, obsessive, ego based?
Well, Stephen Hawking said that in an infinite universe, everything's at the center, which is interesting because the difference is when I think I'm self-centered, I think I'm opposed to everyone else and everyone else is opposed to me. Mm-hmm. But in his version, it means we're all there simultaneously. We all share that, which I would say aligns with this principled basis. I think the bigger concession, and I want to leave this because you're making a couple of really important points, is that if we're in doubt in any way and asking questions, those questions are based on doubtful thoughts. And in an absolute sense, when you start just repeating that the absolute is absolute no matter what I think, you begin to admit that you know more than you think you know, because the absolute nature of knowing is an ever-present absolute state of being. So it doesn't go anywhere when I think it goes somewhere, and it doesn't become less or more when I think more or less of it. And it's just allowing to see thinking for what it is. It's just thinking. It's imagination, effectively. Now, the critical transition here, Philip, in both directions is when I start believing my thinking is true and real, I start making believe who I become is my thinking, and what I think is my thinking, and what other people think of me is who I am. What other people think of me is critical to my life because I think my thinking is threatened by what they think that isn't aligned with what I think. Okay, so there's a war that's potential right there. It's kings fighting each other over what they thought should be right and true, not was actually right and true. But at the same time, like this isn't to suggest we shouldn't or can't do that. But if we're having those thoughts and begin to have them for what they are, it dispels all of the angst and effort in trying to maintain them, because we're simply saying, if I'm in doubt, it's doubtful thinking that's in doubt, period. If I'm feeling bad, something's bad in my thought, period. These are bodily functions. Our functional capacity, our functional literacy is being able to read the body language as a domestic language that we understand, though it isn't always in the words we use. Mm-hmm. And yet we express it in the words we use, as you're talking about. And remember when I first mentioned to our Sunday group to watch their words, people were offended and thought I was saying that to them not to think what they're thinking and not say what they're thinking.
Yeah, I remember that. It's still ongoing.
Yes. And the fact is,
bye, Pedro.
It's about exactly what you're suggesting. Watching is being the observer and saying, what am I doing that's revealing the failings in my thinking, which feelings and words do and actions do. They give us perspective and an opportunity. So does contempt in others. When I have contempt for somebody else, I'm seeing them not as they are, I'm seeing them as I think. And if that's how I'm seeing them, then the source of that thinking is what I'm thinking about myself and refusing to concede I'm doing. So I'm using them to blame and fault to give me perspective to look back and say, oh, that's a good example and another opportunity to witness the immediacy of my own clarity in seeing that I'm seeing them through the lens of my own thoughts, not as they are, but as I'm thinking they are. And begin to dismantle that opposition and that sense of aloneness by saying, wow, The only thing that I don't forgive about other people is not giving them what they already have, which is an absolute knowing nature. And when I think of it in terms of what I think, the lack of forgiveness is on my part because I'm trying to take from them in my own thinking what I can't take from them or give up in me, but make believe in thought I can. And that's where resentments and this unforgiving nature comes from. It's never about the other person. It's always about what I'm thinking in relation to them. So anyway, we'll continue. I love you, and I really appreciate your
Love you
insight
too, Jack.
and working this out with you as we continue to discuss it. And I suspect the conversation gets a little clearer as we do. And some of the other points that are so obvious that can be seen so oblivious just start to appear and become great conversation points. At least I think.
Well, I think it occurred to me in this conversation, and kind of leave you with this, is like, I think we've done 5 since the beginning of February, and I've gone through a very tumultuous period since end of December in terms of things that have occurred. And it's been very helpful to have this conversation with you, and I've been realizing more and more, if anything, this period of time is definitely teaching me how important it is to cultivate, I want to say mindset, and I know that's not exactly in line with the conversation, but just to cultivate and come from a beingness, and how important that is, because I think my languaging and my thoughts in the past have led to a lot of the issues that I had, because underneath them were always this fear of things happening or doubt of things happening or whatever it is. And when they would happen, they'd throw me for a loop. So I think for now, right now, these conversations have definitely put into perspective for me how I really need to take care of my internal operations, just as it is to take the action on the outside. So,
well, and the other side of it, Philip, is to begin to realize that all the action on our outside is actually revealing exactly what we're thinking right now, exactly as it is. It's not something, when we think it shouldn't be what it is, we're thinking how things are right now shouldn't be. And if everything that is here now as it is, that's a pretty big task to make believe it shouldn't be here now. Right? So why wouldn't the world life seem impossible if we take that on rather than say, wait a minute, if I'm manifesting it all and I'm seeing it as I'm thinking, and it's a mess, the mess is mine. And the question is, do I want to continue to maintain that mess? Or do I want to begin to see it from an absolute state of being, because it already is an absolute state of being, and all I'm doing is inflicting on the human experience a diminished capacity and dysfunctional seeming reality, when in fact it's only my conflicted thoughts manifesting those things and making believe now I need to find those things in the world to prove that I'm right.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
Anyway, I love you. I'm very happy for our time together and the fact that we get to spend what we do during the week. And everyone listening, you're always welcome to email questions or thoughts if you'd like. We are available and happy to be available and happy to be upright to avail ourselves of your ears.
All right. I'll see you later, Jack.
Thanks, Philip.